Welcome to the Consortium of Universities for Global Health's regular webinar series. Today, we're pleased to present the impact of proposed cuts to U.S.-funded climate change activities. I'm Dr. Keith Martin, the Executive Director of CUGH. Today, we're pleased to have two leading climate change experts with us today to explain what the climate change cuts are and the impact this will have not only on the United States in terms of our health and prosperity, but also the planet. The first speaker will be Dr. Jon Patz. Dr. Patz is the Chair of Health and the Environment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he directs the University's Global Heath Institute. Dr. Madeleine Thomson is a Senior Research Scientist at the International Research Institute for Climate Change and Society and a Senior Scholar at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. We know that healthy ecosystems and healthy people, clean water, clean air, are vitally important to all of us. They also reduce non-communicable diseases. Climate change is a clear and present danger to all of us. And in fact, we're seeing this every day on the news with extreme weather events, diseases, flooding, and food insecurity. In fact, a study this week also showed that we're currently undergoing the sixth extinction, the worst we've seen since the dinosaurs. And as a result, we're seeing a massive loss of biodiversity. In the face of this, President Donald Trump has proposed for the FY18 budget, 2018 budget, devastating cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Oceanographic and Administrative Agency, the Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes for Health, USAID, and more. This does not work in the interests of the United States in terms of the health, welfare, and prosperity of the US and indeed the world. It is actually going to cause significant harm. So to talk about these issues, the impact that these cuts are going to have, and some of the things all of us can do to be able to address these challenges, to have a healthier, more prosperous society and world, I'd like to turn it over first to Dr. Patz. Jonathan, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Keith. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues that are really pressing. And I'm going to just dive right into the issue as far as climate change, and that is the implications of the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. And then I'm going to talk about proposed federal budget cuts, especially from the Department of Health and Human Services, particularly NIH and CDC, as well as the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. So, you know, we have heard this announcement that the administration has made to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, and this picture is from the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of the Parties, the 21st one. And that was an unprecedented conference that had a record number of heads of state that attended. 147 heads of state attended this meeting. That's more heads of state than any time in history. And coming into the meeting, most countries of the world had commitments, nationally determined commitments for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And what this slide is showing you is that, you know, coming into the Paris Accord, if we do no action, that's the blue line, by the end of the century, we'll warm by 4.5 degrees centigrade. And the big commitments that came in for that conference, like, for example, 40% emissions cuts from the EU, 28% from the US, 64% from Ethiopia, 65% from the Philippines. There were some big commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But even with all of those commitments being met, we would only get to the red line of a warming of about 3.5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, which, according to many of us who have been studying climate change impacts for a long time, is just not enough. And that there's a guide to try to get below 2 degrees centigrade warming before ecosystems fall apart and severe damages happen. So we're trying to get below 2 degrees centigrade. So we're going to have to follow the green line, ratchet success as fast as possible. Need for immediate substantial action. So for climate change, where do we get that impetus to really act quickly? It's through the health frame. And so anytime someone mentions climate change, or more appropriately, the global climate crisis, you should say that is a health issue. That's a public health issue. And the reason this is so important regarding human health, by our pulling out of the treaty, out of the Paris Accord, and by potentially losing momentum on this agreement, is that when you look across these different sectors, the energy sector, food systems, and transportation and urban planning, there are enormous opportunities for improving health around the world. If we look at the first one, the energy sector, you know, we know from the World Health Organization that from outdoor air pollution as well as indoor air pollution, combined, you've got 7 million people that die every year prematurely from air pollution. So if you think about getting to clean energy, which is, of course, the goal, one of the key goals of the Paris Climate Agreement is to get to low carbon energy. You know, that would not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but what else happens when we burn oil and coal and natural gas? We have harmful air pollutants. And in fact, when the policymakers talk about energy policy, they talk about clean energy, what you're seeing here is an estimate that it could cost about or up to $30 to remove 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere. But when you remove that, the CO2, look what else is coming out of those smokestacks. It's more than just greenhouse gas emissions that are disrupting the Earth's climate. You've got, particulate pollution, harmful things that if someone breathes pollution, and we're not talking greenhouse gases, they are harmed in many ways that we know through epidemiologic studies. So if you were to take 1 ton of CO2 out of the air, the upfront investment in technology might cost $30. But the benefits from cleaner air that they come from those other pollutants, the PM 2.5 in particular, there'd be such a benefit that the health benefit far outweighs the cost of cleaner energy. And so this comes from avoided mortality and respiratory health and hospitalizations. And I always ask the policymakers a very tough question, which number is bigger? And they're only thinking about the upfront investment cost, but they're forgetting about the larger half of the equation, which is the health benefits from cleaner air. And if you live in places like Southeast Asia and China, very polluted areas, the health benefit will even be greater. Now, what about the food systems? As far as looking at our diet and greenhouse gas emissions, we know that a high meat diet has a very high carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of protein. And you can see as you go lower in the meat consumption and get to fish and vegan diet, this type of low meat diet means a less environmentally damaging diet. But also, if you eat half the meat, say in the UK, not only do you get a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but of course you get a win-win. You get reduction in saturated fat. And of course that's healthy for cardiovascular health. The last sector I want to talk about is the transportation sector. In the United States, 60% of Americans don't meet the minimum recommended level of exercise every day. Many Americans have a sedentary lifestyle, and we're paying for it. Chronic disease related to physical inactivity are enormous problems. CDC says obesity is #1 problem in the United States. And these graphs, these relationships are showing you the increased benefit. If you have exercise, decreases in cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dementia, colon cancer, breast cancer. We know it's a no-brainer that healthy exercise, more exercises is beneficial. So this is a plug for alternative transportation, which we are going backwards now with the current trends, and I'll go into those in a little more detail. So I just want to mention that, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, we will lose some of those, those win-win opportunities as we get to a low-carbon economy. We are building for a healthier society, especially in the area of chronic diseases. But when President Trump announced withdrawal from the Climate Paris Accord, there was immediate outcry from mayors across the United States and across the world. The C40 cities, that's the mega cities around the world, said, the progress towards a cleaner environment and the sustainable, healthier future, it's not going to be slowed down if the U.S. pulls out, and they're going to keep moving forward. I don't know how many of you have seen this recent climate declaration that says we are still in. This represents 120 million Americans when you look across the cities that are signed on. $6 trillion in the U.S. economy if you look at the businesses that have signed on. And since early June, you've got over 1,000 governors, mayors, businesses, and colleges and universities signed on to this. So even at the federal level, if we're pulling out, the rest of America is not pulling out. And other places like China are stepping forward, and they see the benefit to the Paris Agreement. So we're really putting ourselves at a disadvantage when the rest of the world is stepping forward. Look at what China is doing. This is the world's largest floating solar array in China. And so we are really going to be at a disadvantage by pulling out of the Climate Paris Accord. We're going to be standing alone. Now, I just want to say that this is not a done deal, that the earliest possible date for the U.S. to officially withdraw is not for another 2 years. So there is still time to make some noise and reverse this intention of pulling out of Paris. Last month's G7 leading industrial economies outside of the U.S., you've got Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK all reaffirming strong commitments to swiftly implement the Paris Agreement. And last week's G20, we were standing alone. The U.S. stood alone compared to the other countries. So where we're going to miss out in the wind and solar power revolution that are projected to become a $7 trillion market just in a few decades, China announced a $360 billion investment in renewables over the next 3 years, 13 million new jobs. And jobs mean health. Jobs, income means health. 70% of Americans support the Paris Agreement, and 65% feel the nation should prioritize clean energy. And according to the former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, according to her, she says that governments with the resolve to honor the vision of the Paris Agreement will build a world powered by renewable energy which lifts millions out of poverty. This is about public health. And just out a few months ago, the U.S. Energy and Employment Report showed the high number of jobs in renewable energy. 1 million Americans working full or near full time in energy efficiency, solar, wind, alternative vehicles. That's 5 times more than the current employment in the fossil fuel electric industry. And if you include part-time workers, it's 14 times greater. Again, this is jobs and income is a health matter. And you can see certainly the United States is going to be missing out on this opportunity. These are statistics from the International Renewable Energy Agency. So I'm going to just lead in and talk about cuts in the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Health and Human Services, go over a few cuts, and then hand this off to Madeleine Thomson, who will talk more about cuts and talk about some specific examples. The U.S. EPA overall will be cut. The proposed cut is 31%, including 25% of their workforce, an 80% cut in diesel emission reduction programs. That's a public health challenge. 86% cut in the greenhouse gas reporting. That was formerly the Climate Protection Program. programs like Energy Star, the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership. And there's questions about completely eliminating the EPA STAR grant program. That would be devastating for our research. 61% cut to research on sustainable and healthy communities, and eliminating the cross-agency global change research programs. Say goodbye to the U.S. National Assessment on Climate Change. What about for the Department of Health and Human Services? Overall, an 18% cut, eliminating altogether the Fogarty International Center. That's not good news for global health. 23% cut in the National Institute of Environmental Health, NIEHS. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they want to eliminate the Climate and Health Program. There are many in the United States, there are many states that have these Building Resilience Against Climate Effects, the BRACE program. So many state health departments would not have that funding. 28% in environmental health activities. How many more Flint, Michigans do we really want to have? 41% cut in global health collaboration. And one example of something that I talked about, interface between climate policy and chronic disease. Well, they want to cut that program more than $200 million in chronic disease prevention and health promotion. So I'll end by just saying, I don't know of anyone who is against healthy places and healthy people. And, here's a cartoon that most of you have probably seen a few hundred times by now. But the point is that, even if people don't understand climate change science and they think that it's a big hoax, just by addressing climate change and the things that you would do to get to a low carbon economy, look at this list of benefits. And the idea is, if climate change is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing, it's a win-win. We should be doing this anyway. So bottom line, assigning a price on carbon is the right choice, whether or not someone understands the science of climate change. And getting a price on carbon means talking about the health and environmental costs. So thank you very much for your attention, and you can follow me on Twitter, and if you want, you can check out that book too. So Madeleine's going to talk more specifically about some programs coming out of cuts from NASA and NOAA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patz, and I do encourage everyone to look at Dr. Patz's book. It's an excellent book on climate change and health. And before I turn it over to Dr. Thomson, I just encourage everyone online to get your questions ready, because after Dr. Thomson finishes her comments, then we'll accept your questions and start to pose those to both Drs. Thomson and Patz. So please start to send your questions in now. Madeleine, the floor is now yours. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to initiate this discussion with many people around the world. I hear that you have people coming from every continent that have joined this discussion. And I really wanted to start the discussion, if you like, by really seeing a positive history to where we're at. The reason why we have a consortium of universities of global health, many partners around the world, is in many ways that global health has become a global success story, and in particular an American success story. And if we just go back in time, I know the world that we've seen seems to have been shifted very dramatically, but and look at some of the historical contributions of presidents in the US. We start off with President Carter, whose personal investments in global health through the Carter Center, through investments in trachoma, in guinea worm, in the onchocerciasis control program, really significant, bringing the sort of political limelight to chronic neglected diseases. And then Bush Sr. Initiating the Rio Summit, which, by the way, sort of underpinned the creation of my own institute, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, very much mindful of global climate and environmental change. The Clinton presidency, which really tackled the issue of HIV and AIDS drugs, bringing down the costs so that people could actually be treated globally, and then the Bush Jr. Administration building on that history and building major investments in malaria, which we've seen incredibly effective around the world. And then, of course, the Obama administration building on the prior activities of the previous administrations and adding into that a really sort of strong emphasis on climate and on global health security agenda. So it's, you know, this focus on global health and the focus on environment is not a partisan issue. It's been there in the history of the American administration for decades. And so the situation that we find ourselves in is sort of very shocking, not just on the climate side, but also on the global health side. And I just wanted to highlight the proposed cuts under the President's budget to global health, over $2 billion. And I made also a link to some of the programs specifically targeted for elimination. Jonathan has already mentioned a number of these. I actually realized in preparing for this talk, it's quite hard to find the sort of information you exactly want, not in terms of just looking through the budget, but knowing what that actually means for different programs. But one program that we very severely targeted is the reproductive health care for women and girls around the world, mostly funded through USAID, largely going to be eliminated, and very, very serious impacts there. Lots of the discussion has been that, and just to reinforce that the impact on women's health and women's mortality in childbirth. But as when the preliminary budget was put out in March, there was a suggestion that, oh well, malaria, HIV, etc., the Gavi program were all going to be protected. But it seems to be that while some aspects of the delivery of healthcare for HIV and malaria and control of malaria, etc., will be protected, there are definitely significant cuts that are coming through in a number of angles, which prompted previous President Bush to write this op-ed that global health needs to be protected, and the PEPFAR program, which provides millions of people with drugs to control HIV, needs to be protected. So there are programs that are being undermined across the board. Now, these programs link into our climate work as well. And I want to come back to that a little bit towards the end of my talk. But one of the things that I think those of you who work in global health understand, it's not just the health sector that delivers health. Many aspects of health come from other sectors, and in particular, the climate community contribute knowledge and information on multiple timescales that can be of benefit to the health sector in mitigating and excuse me, reducing the health consequences. And in the US, this is the role of NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, and they've contributed through numerous collaborative research activities with universities in the US and internationally, as well as with international partners and operational partners and the national meteorological agencies around the world to develop information and services of direct relevance to the health community. I just wanted to highlight, for example, the National Integrated Heath and Health Information Services, which is being rolled out at the moment. And we know, and there's very clear evidence of increases in heat waves around the world, including in the US, and populations need to be protected, and they need to be protected with advanced information at the weather time scale, at the seasonal time scale, and for planning purposes and urban development, etc., at longer time scales going forward. And this information, we can't get it if we don't have the climate community they're providing the information. It's just not possible. And they underpin the global data sets, not only on land-based information, but across the seas. And many of you may be aware that the way that we can forecast the climate into the near future, the seasonal climate forecasts or the types of forecasts that we get from El Nino, etc., it's because of the NOAA and its partners monitoring sea surface temperatures and land surface temperatures all around the world. And that's how we get the information that provides predictive services, not just for the health sector, but also for the agricultural community, water resource management, etc. All of these pivotal for the economy, but also fundamentally underpinning the health sector and the health of societies. And I think Jonathan demonstrated very clearly in his talk that you're not talking about direct health services all of the time. If you improve the economy, if you improve the urban landscape, you have major benefits to health as a result. And NOAA, which is in the Department of Commerce, and it has a responsibility towards the economy in general, has a major and significant role in health. These are the types of cuts that are happening, and what's interesting if you look at them is that the major cuts appear to be happening within the climate program, specifically, which is in the Office of Atmospheric Research. And what we see is that those cuts will target the climate data. They target the external research, which is the research funds that are provided by NOAA to researchers outside of the federal system, and to long-term climate prediction. And these are all extremely important for our understanding of what's going to happen with the climate today and also into the future. I just wanted to give one example here in the Northeast. I'm talking to you from New York. We have the Northeast Regional Climate Center. There are climate centers established all across the US which provide information services at climate timescales to all sorts of communities, whether they're the agricultural community, the water resource management community, etc. In New York, we're working with the local and state health services around the challenge of prediction of vector-borne diseases, including West Nile, Lyme disease, and the potential for Zika, etc., and climate information that's relevant, appropriately archived, managed, etc., and at the right scale is of extreme importance to these types of activities, because we see the whole shift in the climate in the US that is happening with generalized warming, but we know that that shift is not a linear process. It varies from year to year with interannual variability. It varies on decadal timescales, which is maybe also part of a natural process. And then we have these strong underlying trends, particularly in temperature. And these are services provided directly by NOAA. And you can see, if you look on the screen, that the majority of these services are proposed to be cut in the FY 2018 budget. Now, you know, one of the challenges I think we have in the current situation is the idea being promoted, which is that the private sector can take on a lot of the work of the federal government. And when it comes to data services, I would say this is absolutely not true. The private sector is extremely good at serving the private sector, but it does not necessarily work to serve as a public good when it comes to data. And I think we've seen this before. President Reagan, in his budget back in the 80s, proposed that Landsat now would be cut from the federal budget. Landsat is the primary satellite system that has been going for 30 years plus, which monitors in detail the land surface of the globe. And his proposal to have this move to the private sector was based on the idea that this served the oil industry, and since it served the oil industry, they could pay for it. Now, if that had gone ahead back in the 80s, we would not have anything like the information that we have available on global environmental change. What actually happened was that it was reviewed extensively, and a big pushback not only from colleagues in Congress, but also from researchers and members of the public. And what happened instead at the time, and I remember it well because I used to be buying Landsat imagery from my meager grant 30 years ago, and it used to cost us $300, which seemed like a lot of money. Instead of putting Landsat into the private sector, what the government did was they took away all of the costs associated with accessing Landsat and made it free as a public good. And what we see now is that Landsat data for the globe is now managed and served by Google Earth Engine and anybody else. Anybody can go and access it for free, but it's being disseminated by a private sector partner, but as a global public good. And that information is available for health, agriculture, water resource managing, urban planning, etc. And in health, it's particularly able to see information on flood risk, information on vector-borne disease distributions, etc. A phenomenal capability, which has also at the same time created a massive economic boom around information services. So I think when you sort of look at what opportunities might have been lost by the privatization of data, that is absolutely something we do not want to see happen now. So having your voice as a global community supporting one of our major partners, it's not just NOAA here, of course, and NASA is also instrumental in this process, is critical for public health delivery. And I think I'm going to stop there and pass it back to Keith for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomson. That was fantastic. Before we receive the questions coming in, I'm going to take a little license and ask a couple of questions here. And I encourage those of you who are signed in to please send your questions in for Drs. Thomson and Patz, and we will pose those questions to them. The Department of Defense has done some extraordinary work on showing the security implications of climate change and what a security threat this is. Can either of you speak to the impact of climate change in terms of insecurity, in terms of conflict, and that connection between climate change as a driver of insecurity, particularly in low resource settings?
Hello,
Yep.
Madeleine here. I'd like to thank you. I think that's a great question, and the importance of climate within DoD has been there for quite some time, who understand that climate is a major risk, and a major risk for civil strife and social instability and also migration. Now, not all of you may be aware that there's been some detailed studies of what happened prior to the disaster that has emerged in Syria, which was preceded by a number of years of drought. And drought, we know, has a major impact on all sorts of aspects of society. It has an impact on the economy, on the livelihoods locally, on the ability of the government to raise taxes and actually provide services. And in Syria, the droughts basically resulted in a large population movement from rural areas into the cities, which was then compounded in many ways by the price hikes that happened in food supplies, which were already also in part attributable to climate. So climate impacts, if you like, on human well-being through many different lenses. And I think that's something that the DoD has been historically very well aware of, although I did note something today where there was a suggestion that climate concerns may be removed from consideration from the Defense Department under the new administration. So I think that's another area of concern.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can just quickly add, Keith, regarding the Syrian situation, I mean, the rural to urban migration rate was 4 to 5 times its normal amount. So there is really a question about how much that could have attributed to this massive problem of the Syrian civil war. But the Defense Department is also worried about where it's sending troops around the world. And if you have an increase in climate-sensitive diseases like malaria, cholera, other types of diseases, they're worried about their troops. They're also worried about sea level rise. I know that in Norfolk, Virginia, they're talking about potential need to move the base. So there have been some formal big reports from the Defense Department showing that they view climate change, or at least before, in the past administration, they viewed climate change as a pretty high priority concern for them.
It is, in fact, the Senate had asked the Department of Defense to do a paper on this, and if anybody wants to look at it, you can get it online. It was a very explicit and poignant paper on the impact of climate change as a major security threat to the United States. And again, the Syrian example, Madeleine, was an excellent example, and as Jonathan, you showed the impact of rising water levels and what that'll do. And the Sahel is also a major area where it's a real tinderbox for climate change. The impacts of climate change as a driver of insecurity and conflict and migration. A question that we have right now is how other sector spending on climate change, the foundations in the private sector, compared to government funding. Do you get a sense of whether the private sector and foundations are coming to the table in terms of taking the place of what the government is proposed to evict?
Well, I can just start off by saying that certainly there's been a big reaction and people realizing how important this issue is, and that, as I mentioned, 70% of Americans think that the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accord, is a very good idea to stay in that, and lots of industry is heading to low carbon fuels. Even in the healthcare sector, we've got in Wisconsin, Gunderson Health made a zero emissions pledge and went to using the landfill to get the methane and power their hospital, and they said, wait a minute, even if we don't care about the environment or couldn't give a hoot about climate change, we just saved $1 million by going to clean energy. So there are a lot of businesses that are just going this direction as far as the economy is heading towards a low carbon economy. I saw a great editorial by Michael Bloomberg talking about stop conning coal communities by promising jobs. It's like Kodak promising more jobs in film, and of course film doesn't exist anymore, barely. So this is where the economy, a lot of businesses are heading in this direction, and we are disadvantaging ourselves by pulling back on that agenda.
Could I just add a couple of comments to that? I think that definitely the foundations, if you like, are stepping up. The private sector, personal donors are stepping up. There have been a number of very high-level discussions in the US and elsewhere about how to get resourcing into the climate and health space. But that does not in any way compensate for what happens from government. And I think that's the big challenge. The foundations are brilliant at being able to test ideas, build innovation, pilot opportunities, etc. But governments talk to governments. And if you want change at the national level, you need that government discussion. And that's where we see very effective programs that are delivered by bilateral agencies, is because that they have the ear of the Ministry of Finance, they have the ear of the Minister of Health or Agriculture or Environment, etc. They're able to make decisions and work and plan together with other government partners. And I think the idea that a foundation can take on that role is just not true. They can make a huge impact on like I say, the innovation space, the education space, etc. But shifts in government policy are really best played out by talking government to government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say add one other thing, Keith, is that after the climate summit at the Carter Center in Atlanta in February, following that meeting, there was a big meeting at the MacArthur Foundation that brought together health NGOs, health foundations, and environmental foundations to step forward in a major way to try to fill the gap. And it's a great movement. It's really great that people are stepping forward, but it does not reach the scale of federal grants and federal incentives. I fully agree with Madeleine. You just can't. They cannot begin to get to that level of funding.
So thanks so much. I'm going to, this question, Jonathan's for you, and then the next one, Madeleine, will be for you. And thanks everybody for sending in your questions. So Jonathan, this one is Alice wants to know what specific ways young healthcare professionals can contribute to the issues of climate change and population health.
Well, it's a great question, and I mean, I think the first thing is to understand that when anyone says climate change or the global climate crisis, that they recognize that it is a health issue. It's not just polar bears and crop failures. Of course, crop failures, that's malnutrition, it's a health issue, but this is a health issue. And I think, number one, recognizing that as a health issue. And as far as getting engaged in this, you know, this is, there's a burgeoning field of environmental public health and understanding relationships between exposure assessment and environmental epidemiology. Anyone in medicine, and this is my own bias, anyone in medicine ought to have a master's of public health as well. And anyone in the health field, my own bias is understanding the preventable diseases. The most prevention is in providing a healthy environment and avoiding unhealthy exposures. So I think this is where there are a number of places to plug in for climate and health. It could be in looking at urban planning and alternative transportation and understanding that benefit. It could be in food systems. There's so much in environmental and health intersection between food waste and healthy food and high energy or you know, high input energy for producing food, like especially red meat, and energy policy, you know, for clean air. So there are broad areas to dive into with regard to health and climate change.
Thanks so much. And so Madeleine, this is a question from Aster, and it relates to the Horn of Africa and even more broadly. We know that there's a catastrophic famine taking place right now, one of the worst the world has ever seen. 20 million people right now are on the cusp of death, and a lot of those drivers are political, as we know, in South Sudan and Yemen. But climate change has a significant impact on what's been taking place in the Horn of Africa for quite some time. Can you share with us any insights you may have on what international organizations may be doing, if anything, about the climate impact in these areas, or more broadly to address the famine taking place in the Horn and more widely in that region?
Sure. So first of all, this is an area that I'm particularly interested in. So thank you very much for the question. One of the things that I mentioned earlier on is that, you know, sometimes when people think about climate change, they just think of these long-term trends, which are what we see as being driven by carbon emissions and other pollutants. But what you have in reality, the experience of people on the ground, is, of course, it's a mixture of natural variability, which happens from a year-to-year timescale, and then what we call decadal, maybe 10, 20-year timescales, where things get a bit warmer or cooler or wetter or drier, and then these underlying trends. And if anybody's particularly interested, we can sort of point to how you would find that out. What's been happening in Eastern Africa, basically from about 1999, is that there was a climate shift in the region. And that shift has been described very well by Brad Lyons, who's now at Maine University, and others, which is related to sea surface temperatures, basically affects the March, April, May season, which is the dominant growing season in equatorial Eastern Africa and southern Somalia. And so what we're seeing there is, if you like, at least in part, a natural cycle of droughts that has been going on in Eastern Africa. But what compounds that natural cycle are these long-term trends in temperature. Now, maybe this sounds a little bit complicated, but when you get a warmer environment, even if you have the same amount of rain falling, that rain doesn't stay around. It basically evaporates and you have a drier outcome. So it's been hugely challenging for countries like Somalia and other Eastern African countries to be able to monitor their own climate effectively. And the reason for this is that even though we have fabulous satellite data, that satellite data is not well calibrated in areas where you don't have a lot of station inputs. So one of the efforts that I'm supporting colleagues on, and particularly the National Met Services in each of these countries, and the IGAD, which is the ICPAC, the Climate Center in Nairobi, which serves the region, is improving the quality of the information and a better understanding of what it's associated with. Is it to do with El Nino? Is it to do with these decadal phenomena? Is it part of these long-term trends? So that is a thing that is happening now, which was not happening before, that has received multiple agency funding, both from NASA, NOAA, DFID, WMO, different agencies coming together to support the countries to get a better handle of actually what's happening to their climate and what is predictable about their climate. So we know an awful lot more now than we did when we started out 10 years ago on what the drivers are of the climate in Eastern Africa, what the impact of these droughts have on the population. That is now, if you like, really well in progress. What we don't have, well, what we did have, it seemed to be like an emerging global consensus on how to respond to droughts in the context of complex emergencies. And Somalia is a complex emergency, and many countries in the region are part of the complex emergencies where political issues, security issues, other factors apart from climate are also making people vulnerable and hugely at risk. And I think the challenge that we have under the current administration is that we're losing ground on that narrative, how to manage complex emergencies with a long-term development strategy. Yes, major crisis in Somalia. We will have other crises in the Sahel, and we will have other crises elsewhere if the pieces that have been put in place to prevent those crises, or at least help mitigate them, are chipped away at. And losing the budgets in global aid is a major part of that process.
Well, thank you very much, Madeleine. Certainly the Defense Secretary said very clearly that if we don't invest in these areas, he would have to buy more bullets. So the Department of Defense is certainly asking for this investment. Jonathan, this question from Bernadette really gets to the heart of this particular webinar. And Bernadette's asking, how would you approach it? What arguments would you put forward to President Trump and the GOP to enlighten them with regard to health issues associated with climate change? What arguments would you pose to them to help change their mind to invest in these areas? Because that's the crux of what CUGH is trying to do, to get the GOP to not make these cuts and to make the investments that we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks for asking that key question. You know, this is where we really need to be vocal. We need to, you know, believe it or not, the Congress is listening. They've gone back. You know, there've been some protests, and they hear how vocal people are, how upset they are. So I think it is time to get louder and to communicate. Now, I think where we can have some major progress here is in listening carefully to what the Republicans are wanting to do, and to look at the common ground. There's a lot of common ground in jobs, and to point out the fact that, you know, that while we really do need to show full compassion to coal communities and have job diversification and financial and infrastructure and education aid, that in fact that is automatically, you know, a dying industry, and that fossil fuel companies need to become energy companies, provide energy, and not just be a coal company or be an oil company, and that the future investment and where the markets are going is to a clean energy market. And so, and you know, a coal company should get into that, and an oil company needs to get into supplying the service of energy rather than simply the product that ends up having an environmental and health cost. So I think there's an economic story. It's common ground, and when you look at the comparison of jobs in the renewable energy sector, it swamps that of the coal industry, certainly. So the jobs and economics is one. The other is health. I do think that, unfortunately, environment is a more polarizing issue. But when you talk about health, people care. Everybody cares about their health. They care about their children's health. Everyone does, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. And so I think showing that this is a health issue, that there's a health frame. It matters to our health. It's not just about the trees and the polar bears, even though I love both of them. The other aspect, another aspect of common ground is infrastructure. There's a lot of attention on infrastructure, $1 trillion commitment for rebuilding infrastructure. Well, I hear about roads and bridges over and over again, maybe an occasional water pump, but it's too much focus on, you know, roads and, you know, highways. And really, if you talk about infrastructure, you're talking about disease preparedness and surveillance. You're talking about safe drinking water. You're talking about sewage. You're talking about all sorts of public health infrastructure that, on the one hand, there's a you know, $1 trillion commitment for infrastructure, and on the other hand, there are cuts that are happening across transportation, and there are all sorts of ill-advised cuts that will damage public health. You know, and so that's where finding common ground in infrastructure that is both good for the economy and for health, I think it's a golden opportunity where you can talk to Republicans. I know that the Citizens Climate Lobby has pushed forward something. There's a new climate caucus in Congress, and the rule is to BYOR, bring your own Republican. So there's a real good bipartisan group called the Climate Caucus happening. But this is where finding the common ground across jobs, health, and infrastructure, I think those would be low-hanging fruit conversations to have with Republicans.
And indeed, this has been a bipartisan issue for a long time, but these cuts are really focus of a larger effort to remove regulations that protect the American public and indeed beyond that the world. And those cuts.
So by the way, that's the worst oxymoron I've ever heard, is job-killing regulation, when really it's a health-promoting safeguard, and it's not at all job-killing.
Indeed, and as Madeleine, you mentioned that the private sector is not tasked to protect the public good. Governments protect the public good. We're down to the last 7 minutes, and Madeleine, this question is for you, based on your expertise, as a world expert in the area of infectious diseases and climate change, as an upcoming Global Health Summit. And perhaps you can just share with us your views on the intersection between climate change and the global health security agenda.
Ah, right. So you're talking about the meeting that's coming up in Vietnam. Yes. So originally, the Global Health Security Agenda was established by, initially formulated by Obama, I think it was in 2014, and it followed the Ebola crisis. And the Ebola crisis in West Africa, many of you will have been aware, horrendous public health crisis, over 10,000 dead. WHO clearly demonstrated as failing in terms of its ability for surveillance and response. But there's sort of, a very terrible start to the whole process and a devastating outcome. However, once they did manage to get organized with the international partners, a very highly constructive, managed response came together. And that demonstrated the potential for the global community to really put to rest major infectious disease outbreaks, such as Ebola. So, obviously there's a watch that's going on now, and there's, there've been some upturns in Congo, etc., which have again been managed very effectively. So the Global Health Security Agenda really started out with a focus on pandemics as its priority. But effectively what it's done is put health and human well-being at the center of discussion around national security, because it's really to do with working with governments and international partners to say these pandemics impact on all aspects of society, whether it's the economy, whether it's your national security issues or internal conflicts, your population movement, etc., etc. And the pandemics are seen as a sort of central part of that. However, they also have now really understood that food crises have a similar role if they're driving populations across borders, etc., as we've already discussed. But then there are other major threats to health security. Some of these come, for instance, from biological threats, from chemical threats, from nuclear threats. We even had the cyber threat in the UK with a WannaCry. It's not just the UK, but in the WannaCry bug that was maybe 3-4 months ago, directly targeted, the ransomware targeted the NHS, the National Health Services ambulance service and hospital services in the UK. So the Global Health Security Agenda, while primarily around infectious disease pandemics, is also beginning to incorporate a broader view of public health threats. And I think that's very important. To date, the Global Health Security Agenda has not incorporated climate as one of the drivers of these threats. And of course, it's just one. There are other drivers, and it's maybe particularly significant for certain aspects of the security agenda and not so much for others. But this is beginning to be addressed. And I think we have a new Director General at WHO, Dr. Tedros, and global health security is one of his 5 major strategic areas, as is climate and health. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity that we should all be mindful of, and building our own work to support WHO's agenda here. So I think those two are beginning to come together, but it's very early days yet. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done to reformulate some of our climate knowledge and climate and health knowledge in the context of health security.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. And we've come to an end of our webinar. And I just want to thank, on behalf of CUGH, Dr. Madeleine Thomson, Dr. Jon Patz, for speaking to this really vital issue that goes to the health, welfare of and prosperity of people, not only here in the United States, but around the world. We know that a polluted, hotter environment is one that only harms people's health and harms people's employment. The EPA, NOAA, the Centers for Disease Control, and USAID, they all work to advance the health, safety, and security of people here and around the world, and they are job creators. The regulations and resources that they need to do their job must be in place and must be strengthened and not removed. For those who are online, what can you do about this? Please look at our website at the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, cugh.org. We will have this website up by early next week. I'll include the article, the report that was done by the Department of Defense on security and climate change, so you will have that. I'm Dr. Keith Martin, and on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this session. I'd like to thank Karen Lamb here at CUGH for putting this on, and again, Dr. Patz and Dr. Thomson for being here and for their work. Please come and attend our conference next year, March 15th to 18th in New York City, where this issue and others will be discussed, and we'll have a chance to work together to address them. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this webinar, and have a wonderful day.
Pete, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
We're probably offline. Nice job, Madeleine.